The number on the screen was 31. Nathan Cole stared at it for a long time. 31 days. That was how long they had before the Zethali probe reached the outer edge of the Kepler 442 system. He had run the calculation 3 times himself and asked 2 other people to run it after him. The answer was always the same. 31 days. He turned away from the screen and walked to the observation port on the far wall of the command room. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the asteroid field stretching out in every direction, a slow river of rock and iron that had been drifting through this system for billions of years without anyone paying it much attention. That was the whole point. Nobody came here. Nobody had ever needed to. Until humans did. The command room sat inside a hollowed-out rock, roughly 2 kilometers wide. From the outside, it looked like every other piece of debris in the field. The surface was uneven and dark, dusted with the same carbon coating that covered everything else in this part of space. There were no lights visible from outside. There were no exhaust plumes. There were no transmissions except on frequencies so narrow and so carefully timed that intercepting them would require knowing exactly where to look and exactly when to listen. Nathan had spent a great deal of his life making sure that nobody knew either of those things. He was 56 years old, and he had been running the Titan program for 11 of those years. Before him, a woman named Carol Atkins had run it for 9 years. Before her, a man named George Sutter had run it for 8. George was the one who had selected the Kepler 442 system. He had been a structural engineer before he became an administrator, and he had chosen this place because the asteroid field was dense enough to hide construction platforms, but stable enough that collisions were rare. He had been right on both counts. Nathan had never met George in person. George had died of a heart attack in a private hospital in Oslo 4 years before Nathan took over. His work, however, was everywhere Nathan looked. Beyond the asteroid field, at a distance that required a long-range display to see clearly, 3 objects hung in space. They were not asteroids. Diana Ford had not slept in 31 hours. She knew this because she had not slept since she found the flaw, and she had found the flaw at approximately 6 in the morning by the station's internal clock. It was now past 1 in the afternoon of the following day, and she was still in the same section of the drive core access tunnel, hanging in zero gravity with a diagnostic pad strapped to her left forearm and a cold cup of coffee floating 3 feet away from her head. The flaw was in the 3rd Titan's primary drive assembly. Specifically, it was in the resonance coupling between the 4th and 5th compression rings. When Diana ran the activation sequence at full power, the coupling vibrated at a frequency that the design specifications said should not be possible. It was not possible according to any of the models. The models were wrong. She had checked the models 6 times. The coupling vibrated at 7.3 Hz above its rated tolerance. At low power, this meant nothing. At 70% power, the effect was manageable, a slight reduction in efficiency, nothing that would register on a standard diagnostic. At full power, the vibration would amplify through the compression rings in a cascade that her simulation showed would reach critical structural failure in approximately 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The 3rd Titan would not be destroyed. Not immediately, but the drive assembly would tear itself apart, and the ship would go from being the most powerful weapon in human history to a 4,000-kilometer piece of very expensive scrap metal. Diana pressed her palm against the bulkhead and pushed herself down the tunnel toward the primary junction. She needed to look at the physical coupling, not a scan of it. She needed to see it with her own eyes. Owen Bradley was already there when she arrived. He was 26 years old and had been assigned to the logistics division of the outer platform for 7 months. He was not supposed to be in the drive core tunnel. He was not supposed to know that drive core tunnels existed on this structure. He was not supposed to know what this structure was. He had figured it out anyway. Diana had discovered this 3 weeks ago when she found him reading a maintenance manifest that he should never have been able to access. She had come very close to reporting him. She had thought about it for 2 days straight. Then she had decided not to, for reasons she could not fully explain to herself, except that Owen had not told anyone what he knew, and he had not tried to leverage the information, and he had simply kept doing his job with the kind of quiet diligence that reminded her of herself at his age. She had also decided that if she was going to solve a problem the size of the one she was currently looking at, an extra pair of hands would not hurt. Owen was holding a portable light up to the fourth compression ring, tilting his head to see along the angle of the coupling joint. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her coming. "I see it," he said. "What do you see?" "The joint is slightly off-axis. Maybe half a degree. Not enough to show up on a surface scan." Diana pulled herself alongside him and looked where he was pointing. He was right. The joint was off by just enough to introduce a small asymmetry into the energy path, and at full power, that small asymmetry would grow very quickly into something catastrophic. She had already known this. Hearing someone else say it out loud did not make her feel better. It made it more real. "How did this happen?" Owen asked. "Assembly error," Diana said. "Probably happened 3 years ago during the final compression ring installation. Someone mounted the coupling bracket at the wrong angle. The tolerance check did not catch it because it was within the acceptable range for all standard operations. But not for full activation. Not for full activation, she confirmed." Owen was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the coupling with an expression that Diana recognized because she had been wearing it for the past 31 hours. It was the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the answers. "Can you fix it?" Diana took a long breath. She released it slowly. In zero gravity, the sound of your own breathing was very present, and she had become very aware of it over the past day and a half. "Not the way you mean," she said. "Not in any reasonable amount of time. Correcting the angle on that coupling requires dismantling 4 compression rings, which means taking apart most of the forward drive assembly, rebuilding it to specification, and running a full calibration sequence. We are talking 8 weeks minimum. We do not have 8 weeks. No, we have a lot less than 8 weeks." Nathan Cole received the report from Diana at 14:47 station time. He read it twice, then called her on a direct line and asked her to tell him the important parts again in spoken words. He found that some things were easier to understand when they were said out loud by the person who discovered them. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. "What are your options?" he asked. "2," she said. "I can attempt a partial correction. Shim the coupling bracket to reduce the off-axis angle. That would bring us to about 65% power operation without failure risk. The third Titan would still be functional, just significantly reduced in capability." "And the second option?" There was a pause on the line. Nathan noticed the pause. It told him something. "I can redesign the flaw," Diana said. "Instead of trying to fix the resonance problem, I convert it into a controlled system. The cascade failure at full power is not random. It follows a very predictable amplification curve. If I install a specific set of harmonic dampeners in the correct positions, I can channel the resonance into a single directional pulse rather than letting it tear apart the assembly. You turn a malfunction into a weapon. Essentially, the drive core survives. The ship keeps full operational capability, but it also gains something the other 2 Titans do not have, a one-time emergency pulse weapon with a destructive yield I would rather calculate before describing." Nathan was quiet again. He was doing his own arithmetic now. What is the problem with option 2? Another pause. "The dampener installation requires work on the external hull. Not extensive work, but external. We would need to be outside the ship for approximately 14 days, working in open space. And the Zethali probe arrives in 31 days. Yes. So if the probe arrives early, or if its sensors are better than our models suggest, your team is visible, working on the outside of a structure that is not supposed to exist in a system that the Zethali are already curious about." "Yes," Diana said again. "That is the problem with option 2. Nathan set down the communication device and looked out the observation port again. The 3 objects floated in the dark at their customary distance, massive and silent. 30 years of work. Somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion of redirected human industrial output. The careers of 900 people who had given their normal lives to a secret that no government outside a very small circle of Earth's leadership even knew existed. The colonists on the outer worlds who paid higher taxes than they should have and were told it was infrastructure spending. The researchers whose papers were quietly suppressed. The engineers who could not talk about what they had built, not to their families, not to their oldest friends, not to anyone. All of it sitting 31 days away from possible discovery. He picked up the communication device again. Diana, how confident are you in option 2? The engineering is sound. The concept works. I have run the simulations 40 times. And Owen Bradley, can he be trusted with the external work? A longer pause this time. He already knows what we are building. He figured it out on his own, and he did not tell anyone. If that is not a trust test, I do not know what is. Nathan thought about this. He did not have a good answer to it. The logic was irritating because it was correct. You understand that if the probe arrives early, I cannot protect either of you. I understood that about myself before I even brought you the options, Diana said. I just wanted you to understand it too. Nathan was not a sentimental person. He had made a conscious effort over the course of his career to be as unsentimental as possible, because the program required clear thinking above everything else, and sentiment made clear thinking harder. But something in the way Diana said that last sentence made him close his eyes for a moment. Proceed with option 2, he said. Start tomorrow morning. 412 light years away, in a meeting room on a neutral orbital station called Concord Platform 7. Ambassador Laura Mitchell was in the middle of explaining why humanity's trade quota request was both reasonable and historically consistent with prior agreements. She had been explaining this for 40 minutes. The Concord Trade Committee had 7 members, representing 7 species, and at least 3 of them had stopped paying close attention somewhere around the 20-minute mark. Laura knew this because she was very good at reading rooms, and reading rooms was a skill that had kept her employed in this job for 4 years. She knew when someone was genuinely listening and when they were performing the act of listening, and the difference between the two was usually in the eyes. Species varied in their eye anatomy considerably, but the fundamental quality of active attention versus polite endurance translated across most of them. She finished her remarks and accepted the committee's promise to review the request by the end of the current session. She thanked them warmly. She gathered her materials and walked out into the corridor with her aide, a quiet young man named Patrick Crane who had been with her for 2 years and who had a gift for appearing calm even when he was not. 3 no votes guaranteed, he said quietly as they walked. For Laura said, the Variety delegate decided somewhere around minute 25. I saw it. What do we do? We accept the loss gracefully, and we request a follow-up session in 6 weeks. That is the normal process. Patrick nodded and made note. They were approaching the main corridor junction when a figure stepped out from a side passage with the particular smoothness of someone who had been waiting there on purpose. Counselor Veth of the Zethali Empire was tall by the standards of his species, which made him very tall by the standards of most other species. His coloring was a deep blue-gray that Laura had privately always found striking, and his eyes were the pale amber that marked senior members of the Zethali administrative caste. He wore a simple dark tunic with no insignia. The Zethali did not wear their ranks on their clothes. They wore them in the way they stood and the way they looked at you. Veth looked at Laura the way a person looks at a door they're trying to decide whether to open. Ambassador Mitchell, he said. His galactic standard was perfect. The Zethali had always been excellent linguists. A moment, if you have one. Of course, Counselor. She nodded to Patrick, who understood immediately and found somewhere else to be. Veth walked alongside her in the direction of the observation lounge at the end of the corridor. He moved unhurriedly. He did not speak for the first 30 seconds, which was a technique Laura recognized and did not react to. The Trade Committee will not approve your quota request, he said eventually. I had gathered that impression. The Zethali delegation's position is neutral on the substance. We have no particular interest in blocking human commerce. But the Variety have asked for our support on a separate matter, and this is the currency they requested. Laura appreciated the directness. The Zethali were often direct in private while being opaque in public, which was the opposite of most species. She found it refreshing even when what they were being direct about was inconvenient. I understand how alliances work, Counselor. I know you do. He paused near the observation window at the end of the lounge. Outside, Platform 7 hung against the black, a massive construction of light and motion. I wanted to tell you because I think it is more useful to you than a polite surprise of the next session. Thank you. That is genuinely useful. Another silence. This one had a different quality. Laura had learned to distinguish between the silences that preceded something routine and the silences that preceded something she needed to pay attention to. This was the second kind. The Zethali Survey Division has been conducting a mapping update in several outer systems, Veth said. A routine exercise. We do these every 15 years. Of course, during this particular update, our survey instruments registered a gravitational anomaly in a system that our charts classify as uninhabited. The anomaly is unusual. The mass readings suggest concentrations that do not correspond to the listed geological survey from 40 years ago. Laura kept her expression entirely still. She was very good at this. She had practiced it in mirrors when she was younger, before she understood that the real technique was not muscular control, but something deeper, a kind of inner quiet that you had to actually achieve rather than perform. She had achieved it now. Her face was open and mildly interested, which is the exact correct face to show someone who is watching you very carefully. That does sound like something worth investigating, she said. It does, yes. Veth turned from the window and looked at her directly. We have dispatched a probe. It will arrive in the area within a month. How fascinating. What do you expect to find? Veth held her gaze for just a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Then he smiled. The Zethali smile was subtle, a slight widening around the eyes more than anything in the mouth. Laura had only learned to read it after her second year on the job. Geological formations, most likely, he said. As I said, it is routine. I mention it only because the system in question falls within a region that is adjacent to human-charted space. I thought you might find the information relevant. I appreciate your thoroughness, Counselor. The Zethali always appreciate thoroughness in others, he said. It makes interactions more honest. He inclined his head slightly. Enjoy the rest of the session, Ambassador. He walked away. Laura stood at the observation window and watched the lights of Platform 7 for a long moment. Her reflection was faint in the glass. She looked at it without expression. Then she turned and walked quickly to find Patrick. The external work began at first light by the station clock, which meant nothing to the space outside, but provided a useful shared rhythm for the people working in it. Diana and Owen suited up at 6 o'clock. Their suits were standard-issue maintenance rigs, the same kind used on any orbital platform across human space. There was nothing about them that would look unusual to a passing observer. The tools they carried were ordinary too: hull contact welding equipment, a dampener installation kit, diagnostic sensors. Everything had a plausible explanation that had nothing to do with what they were actually doing. The third Titan's hull was not like any other hull Diana had worked on in her career. Most large ships had surfaces that felt, at some level, like ships. You could stand on them and look in a direction and see where the ship ended and space began. Standing on the third Titan was different. The curve of the hull was so gradual that it felt, standing on the surface, like standing on a planet. The horizon was far away. The surface went on in all directions, gray and slightly textured, interrupted occasionally by structures that looked small until you got close to them and realized they were the size of apartment buildings. Diana had worked on all 3 Titans during the construction phase. She had never stopped finding this disorienting. They moved along the hull toward the forward drive assembly in a slow magnetic boot walk, tethered to the surface at all times. Owen was quiet as they moved. He was good in suits, Diana noted, better than many engineers she had worked with. He had a natural sense of his own center of gravity, and he did not make the mistake that inexperienced people made of fighting the suit's momentum. First dampener goes here, Diana said, stopping at a marked point on the hull and crouching down to inspect the surface. Then 7 more at the points I flagged on the schematic. We work from forward to aft, install each dampener in sequence, and then run a synchronization calibration on day 13 before the final connection on day 14. What happens if the calibration is off? The pulse does not focus properly, and we have done a lot of work for a reduced result. But the drive assembly still survives activation. The downside case is still better than leaving the flaw as it is. Owen knelt beside her and looked at the hull surface. He was quiet for a moment. What does the probe get here? 17 days now. He did not say anything after that. He opened his tool case and began laying out the installation equipment in the careful, methodical way that Diana had already come to associate with him. She watched him for a moment and thought that in another life, in a world where the Titan program did not exist, and she had gone into private engineering like her college roommate, she might have had a junior colleague like Owen. She might have taught him things over the course of a normal career, and he might have gone on to build things that had his name attached to them. She turned back to the work. On day 8, Nathan received a revised estimate from the Zethali probe's projected trajectory. It was not good news. The probe had made a course correction 3 days after launch, tightening its path through the system in a way that cut 6 days off the original arrival estimate. The new number was 11 days. Diana and Owen had 6 days of work remaining after the synchronization calibration. The margin was now essentially zero. Nathan sat with this information for 2 hours before calling anyone. He sat in his chair in the command room and looked at his calculations and thought about all the ways the next 11 days could go wrong. There are many ways. The probe could be more sensitive than the Zethali's standard survey equipment. It could carry advanced optical sensors capable of resolving objects at long range. It could transmit in real time rather than storing data for later retrieval, which would mean that if it detected anything, the Zethali would know about it immediately rather than when the probe returned. It could arrive exactly on schedule, or it could make another course adjustment that brought it in 2 days early. Nathan had spent his career thinking about how things could go wrong. It was the most important skill in his work. The second most important skill was knowing when to stop thinking about how things could go wrong and make a decision. He called Diana. The probe arrives in 11 days, he said. Not 17. A silence on the line. How? Course correction. We just received the updated telemetry. Another silence. We can accelerate the installation, Diana said. Work longer shifts. Skip the overnight rest period. We could compress the 14-day schedule to 11 days if we push. What does that do to the calibration quality? It reduces the precision window. Instead of a 12-hour calibration, we would have a 4-hour calibration. The dampeners will still synchronize, but there is a higher margin of error. Maybe 3 to 4% additional variance in the pulse focus. Acceptable? Probably. The pulse is powerful enough that a 4% variance in focus does not change the effective outcome significantly. We would know for certain once we ran the calibration. Do it, Nathan said. And Diana, tell me honestly, are you and Owen physically up to this? A short pause, and then something that might have been a quiet sound of amusement. We have been sleeping 4 hours a night since day 3 anyway, she said. It is not that different. Nathan closed the line and turned back to his displays. He began drafting a contingency plan. If the probe arrived before the work was complete, he had 3 options. The first was to pull Diana and Owen back inside the hull and hope the probe sensors could not resolve what had already been installed. The second was to bring the Titan's low-power stealth systems online, which would reduce its sensor signature but would also require running a low-level energy output that a sufficiently sensitive probe might detect anyway. The third option was one he did not write down because it involved actions that could not be undone and that he was not yet willing to consider. He set the contingency plan aside and looked at the display showing the 3 Titans in their orbits. He thought about George Sutter, who had chosen this system and who had died before seeing any of this. He thought about Carol Atkins, who had spent 9 years of her life on the program and had retired to a small house in the Pacific Northwest, and who, to his knowledge, had never once spoken publicly about any of it. He thought about the first engineer to set foot on the construction platform, a man named Harold Kim, who had stood in an empty metal frame in deep space and tried to imagine what it would eventually become. He thought about Diana Ford, sleeping 4 hours a night and waking up to work on the outside of something the size of a planet, in the dark with a deadline she could not control closing in. Day 11 arrived on a Tuesday by the station calendar. Diana and Owen were outside at 4:30, 4 hours before the probe's projected arrival window. They had 1 dampener remaining and the calibration sequence to run. Diana had the final dampener installed by 6:15. Owen ran the connection checks while she set up the calibration equipment. The calibration was the most technical part of the whole process. The 8 dampeners had to be synchronized to within a very precise frequency tolerance, all responding to the same harmonic pattern at the same time. If even one was slightly off, the resonance channel would fracture under load. Diana had written the calibration algorithm herself. She had tested it in simulation more times than she could count. Watching it run in the real world, on the actual hardware, with the probe possibly 40 minutes away, was a different experience from watching it run in a model. The first 3 dampeners synchronized cleanly. The 4th took 3 attempts. Owen held the portable sensor array in place, while Diana adjusted the frequency input manually. On the 3rd try, the dampener locked in and the calibration light turned from amber to green. For down, Owen said. 5, 6, and 7 went quickly. The 8th was the last, and it was also the one Diana had been most worried about, because it sat in the most mechanically complex section of the hull, and the coupling geometry made the frequency alignment sensitive to very small positioning errors. She knelt over it with her calibration tool and worked slowly and carefully. She was aware of the time. She was aware of Owen standing beside her, not saying anything, just holding the light steady so she could see. The 8th dampener locked in. Diana sat back on her heels, or as close to sitting back on her heels as the suit allowed, and looked at the calibration display. 8 green lights in a row. The synchronization variance was 2.1%. Better than the 4% she had told Nathan was acceptable. "It is done," she said. Owen let out a long, slow breath. They were back inside the hull by 8:40. The probe's projected arrival window was 8 to 10 o'clock. Nathan's last message, which had arrived 30 minutes ago, said that long-range sensors had not yet detected the probe entering the system. This could mean it was running late. It could also mean its approach angle put it outside their sensor coverage. Diana and Owen removed their suits in the airlock and then sat on the floor of the equipment room, which was not the most dignified place to be, but which was the nearest flat surface, and they did not speak for a little while. The lights in the equipment room were functional and slightly too bright, the kind of lighting that exists purely to allow work to be done and makes no other concessions. Diana's reflection in the visor of her stored helmet looked tired in a way that a full night of sleep would not completely fix. Owen stretched his neck and winced. "Do you think we will ever be able to talk about this?" he asked. Diana considered the question. "Eventually," she said. "When it is over." When is it over? She did not have an answer to that. She thought about the outline of what came next, the things Nathan had quietly shared with her about the broader plan, the pieces she had assembled herself over the years. The Titans were built. They worked. The people who needed to know they existed now knew. At some point, the situation that had made them necessary would reach the moment they had been built for. She did not say any of this out loud. Soon, she said. The probe entered the system at 9:17 and completed its sweep in 6 hours and 40 minutes. Nathan watched the telemetry data in real time. The probe's sensor package was a standard Zethali survey configuration, the same model used in their 15-year mapping updates. It was a good sensor package. It would detect metallic objects at close range, measure gravitational gradients with reasonable precision, and record optical imagery at a resolution sufficient to identify large features. The 3 Titans registered on its sensors as asteroid mass objects in close orbit. The hull plating of the Titans was designed to scatter radar and absorb most active sensor frequencies. At the probe's closest approach distance of roughly 90,000 kilometers, the resolution of its optical system was not sufficient to distinguish hull plating from a regular rock surface. The probe logged 3 entries in its geological survey database. Unclassified mass concentration 7743. A. Unclassified mass concentration 7743. B. An unclassified mass concentration 7743C. It noted their orbital characteristics, flagged them as potential candidates for a closer survey at a future date, and moved on. Nathan received confirmation of the probe's departure from the system at 16:03. He sat in his chair for a long time after that. He did not move. He did not call anyone. He looked at the 3 entries in the probe's log data on his secondary display, translated from Zethali survey notation, and thought about the word unclassified. Unclassified, not unidentified, not suspicious, just unclassified, one of 10,000 rock formations logged in a routine sweep, filed away in a database that a junior analyst would process in 6 months and mark as low-priority follow-up. He breathed out slowly. It had worked. The probe had come and gone, and the Titans were still a secret. But the thing about secrets, Nathan had learned over 30 years of keeping this particular one, was that they did not stay in one place. They moved. They changed shape. The probe was gone, but Veth had sent it because Veth already suspected something, and suspicion that was not satisfied had a way of growing. The next probe would be better. The next survey would be closer. The galaxy was patient, and so were the people in it who were good at finding things. Nathan thought about this for a while. Then he picked up the communication device and opened a line to Admiral Carl Weiss. Carl had been running the Operational Readiness Program for the Titan fleet for 3 years. He was a careful man and a methodical one, and every time Nathan spoke with him, Carl reminded him of the window. The window was the period of time during which the Titans were operational and the secret was still intact. The window could be wide or narrow. Once it closed, it would not open again. Nathan had always known this. He had known it longer than Carl had. He had simply spent the past decade focused on the construction and the secrecy on the building of the thing, because building it was his job. Making decisions about what the thing did and when was a different question. Carl answered on the second signal. "Cole," he said. "The probe cleared the system 2 hours ago. No indication of detection." A pause on Carl's end. "Good news. It will not be the last probe. Veth is patient, and he is not going to stop wondering." "No," Carl agreed. "He is not." Silence on the line for a moment. Both of them knew what the conversation was moving toward. "The fleet is ready," Carl said. "The crews are ready. The third Titan's drive issue is resolved, based on what Diana reported this morning. All 3 ships are at full operational status." Nathan looked out the observation port. The 3 shapes were visible at their usual distance, still and enormous and dark. He thought about 30 years of quiet work. He thought about George Sutter and Carol Adkins and Harold Kim and Diana Ford and Owen Bradley and the 900 people who had given pieces of their lives to a program with no public name. He thought about the colonies on the outer worlds, 11 settled planets full of ordinary people who had no idea what had been built on their behalf in the dark between stars. He thought about Counselor Veth standing at the observation window on Platform 7, smiling his subtle Zethali smile at Laura Mitchell. He thought about the word unclassified. The window was still open. "For now, we are ready," Nathan said. He closed the line and sat alone in the quiet. Outside, 3 planet-sized warships waited in the dark, patient as stone, for the moment that 30 years of silence had been building toward. The first distress signal arrived at 4:11 station time. Laura Mitchell was asleep when it came in. Patrick Crane knocked on her cabin door 3 times before she answered, and when she opened it, he was standing in the corridor with a data pad in his hand and an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the expression of someone delivering inconvenient news. It was the expression of someone delivering news that changed the shape of things. She took the pad and read it standing in the doorway. 3 outer human colonies had been hit in a coordinated strike. Meridian Station in the Callaway system. The agricultural settlement on Harrow's World. The transit hub at Juno's Reach. All 3 attacked within a 40-minute window, which meant the operation had been planned and the timing was not accidental. The forces involved were Zethali. The official justification, transmitted through a Zethali military channel and already distributed to every Concord member, described the actions as a resource enforcement response to long-standing treaty violations. Laura read the justification twice. Meridian Station processed ore from 2 asteroid belts and employed about 11,000 people. Harrow's World grew grain and soybeans for 6 colony systems and had a population of roughly 40,000. Juno's Reach was a waypoint hub with no military presence, no significant industrial output, and a rotating population of about 3,000 at any given time. None of them had committed treaty violations. The justification was invented. Laura had been in diplomacy long enough to recognize an invented justification, and this one was not even a careful invention. It was the kind of justification that was written to be transmitted, not to be believed. She handed the pad back to Patrick and told him to have her formal clothes ready in 10 minutes. He asked what she was going to do. She told him she was going to go to the Concord Council floor and do her job. She did not tell him what she already knew, which was that her job was about to change completely. Carl Weiss received his deployment orders at 4:19, 8 minutes after the first distress signal reached the Concord network. He was already awake. He had been awake since 3 o'clock, sitting in the small operations room of the lead Titan with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside him, reading status reports that all said the same thing. Every system nominal, every crew at readiness, every ship prepared for an activation that had not yet been authorized. He had been reading those reports for 3 years. He had become very familiar with the word nominal. When Nathan's message came through, Carl read it once and set down the cold tea and stood up. He walked to the operations console and pulled up the activation checklist. He had reviewed it so many times that he no longer needed to read it. But he read it anyway, because careful men did careful things even when they did not need to, and Carl Weiss was, above all, a careful man. He pressed the activation key at 4:23. The sound that followed was unlike anything Carl had heard in 30 years of military service. It was not loud. It was almost gentle at first, a deep harmonic hum that traveled through the floor and into his boots and up through his legs and into his chest, where it sat like a second heartbeat. The Titan systems had been in cold standby for so long that their startup sequence had a particular quality to it, like something enormous waking slowly from a very long sleep. Then the other 2 Titans came online, and the hum multiplied. And for a moment, Carl just stood very still and let himself feel the full weight of what was happening. He had commanded warships before. He had commanded the largest conventional human warship in service at the time, a vessel called the Ardent, which had been considered a significant piece of military hardware by the people who evaluated such things. The Ardent was 2 kilometers long. Standing on the operations deck of the lead Titan, Carl sometimes tried to calculate how many Ardents would fit inside the structure around him. The number was always so large that it stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like an abstract concept. He opened the fleet communication channel. All stations, this is Admiral Weiss. We have deployment orders. Coordinates are transmitted. Fold sequence in 12 minutes. Everyone to their positions. The channel filled with acknowledgments, calm and professional, from 3 ships and 900 crew members who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Carl sat back down at the console. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter than that, something he did not quite have a word for. He thought about what was going to happen in the next few hours, and he thought about the people on Meridian Station and Harrow's World and Juno's Reach who had woken up that morning to something they had no way to prepare for, and he thought about what it meant to carry the power that he was about to carry. He had wanted this for a long time. He had wanted it since the second time a Zethali patrol had parked itself in a human system and ignored the formal protests and simply sat there, patient and immovable, until the human government quietly gave them what they wanted. He had wanted it with a particular kind of anger that he had spent years learning to manage. Now that it was here, the anger was mostly quiet. What remained was something more like responsibility. The fold sequence began at 4:35. The Zethali fleet commander at Meridian Station was a senior officer named Drav, and Drav had fought in 3 border engagements over the course of his career and had always performed well under pressure. He was not easily surprised. He was surprised now. His sensors had been showing the human defense forces in retreat for approximately 2 hours. The engagement was proceeding exactly as the strategic plan had outlined. The humans had smaller ships, fewer ships, and less capable weapons. They had fought with more determination than Drav had expected, but determination without capability produced only a slower version of the same result. The outcome had never been in doubt. Then the sensor array went strange. The readings that came back made no sense at first. The system was registering 3 objects of extraordinary mass arriving at coordinates that had been empty space 40 seconds earlier. The objects were not following a standard approach vector. They had not transited in from a jump point. They had simply appeared, which was not something that happened according to any propulsion technology Drav was aware of. His sensor chief ran a diagnostic on the array. The array was functioning correctly. Drav looked at the mass readings again. Each of the three objects registered at approximately 2.4 times the mass of the largest Zethali military installation in service. The largest Zethali military installation in service was a space station that had taken 30 years to build and was considered one of the most significant engineering achievements in the Empire's history. Whatever was now sitting between his fleet and the open system was not a space station. The objects were moving, slowly, but with the deliberate precision of something that knew exactly where it was going. They arranged themselves into a formation that placed them between the Zethali fleet and every practical exit vector from a system. The maneuver took about 4 minutes and was performed without any visible effort. Drav's communications officer reported that a transmission had arrived on all active Zethali frequencies simultaneously. It was in galactic standard, clear, and unencoded. Drav listened to it. The voice was unhurried. It identified itself as Admiral Carl Weiss of the human fleet. It stated that the Zethali forces currently operating within human territorial space were to stand down immediately and begin a full withdrawal. It stated that all 3 colony sites were to be evacuated by Zethali personnel within 2 hours. It stated that no human vessels or personnel were to be interfered with during the withdrawal. It stated that a response was not required, only compliance. It stated that the withdrawal window was 4 hours from the time of transmission. Then it said nothing else. There was no threat of what would happen if the deadline was not met. There did not need to be. The sensor readings said everything that words could not improve on. Drav sat very still for a moment. He was a senior officer, and he had a responsibility to consider his options. He considered them. There were technically 3 options, and 2 of them ended with outcomes his training prevented him from choosing. The third option was compliance. He opened a channel to the fleet and began issuing withdrawal orders. The Galactic Concord Council Chamber held 62 seats, and at this particular emergency session, 59 of them were occupied. The 3 absent delegations had sent notices of delayed arrival. Everyone else had come quickly, which in itself told a story. Laura sat in the human delegation seat and kept her hands flat on the table in front of her. Patrick was behind her. He had not said anything since they entered the chamber, and Laura appreciated this. She needed to be very still right now. The council chair, a thin blue-skinned representative from the Vorith collective named Eln, called the session to order and read the situation report. 3 human colonies attacked. Zethali forces confirmed. Death toll preliminary, but significant at Juno's Reach, where the transit hub structural systems had been damaged. Diplomatic protests lodged by the human delegation and 3 other member delegations. Standard procedure called for a formal response statement and a motion for mediation. Elm asked for statements. 4 delegations spoke, including the Virati, who expressed measured concern while carefully avoiding any language that could be interpreted as a direct criticism of the Zethali. The Zethali delegation's representative, a young diplomat named Cord who was not Veth and who had clearly been given a prepared script, read a statement describing the actions as proportionate and within the framework of existing resource agreements. Laura did not respond to this. She had been about to, and then something happened. Patrick put a hand briefly on her shoulder, which was not something he ever did in session. He leaned down and said 2 words very quietly near her ear. She looked at the secondary display on the table in front of her and read the update that had just come through on the secure channel. She read it twice. She set the display face down on the table and folded her hands on top of it. The Zethali diplomat finished his prepared statement. Eln asked if the human delegation wished to respond before the mediation motion was introduced. Laura stood up. She said that she would like to request a brief recess of 2 hours before the mediation motion was introduced. She said the human delegation had received information that might be relevant to the council's deliberations. She said she would be grateful for the council's patience. Ellen looked at her for a moment with the careful attention of someone trying to read a situation that had just changed shape. The recess was granted. The 2 hours passed. During those 2 hours, the Concorde's independent sensor network received confirmation from 17 separate observation posts of 3 unclassified objects of extraordinary mass currently sitting in the Callaway system, where Meridian Station was located. All 17 confirmation readings agreed on the mass. They agreed on the position. They agreed on the fact that the objects had arrived via a propulsion method that did not correspond to any technology in the Concorde's technical database. They also agreed that the Zethali forces in the Callaway system, the Harrow system, and the Juno system were withdrawing. Orderly and complete withdrawals, without engagement, without incident. The senior intelligence officer of the Morith Alliance, whose desk received real-time feeds from 14 independent sensor networks, spent the first hour trying to find an explanation for the readings that did not require him to conclude what the readings actually said. He went through 17 alternative hypotheses. He eliminated them one by one. By the end of the hour, he was sitting very quietly in his office, looking at his desk, thinking about what it meant for the galaxy that a species everyone had understood to be moderately capable had apparently spent several decades quietly building something that made every other military force in explored space look like a hobby. The Zethali Intelligence Service reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time. They reached it with less equanimity. Counselor Veth was in his private office on the Concorde station when the full report arrived. He read it carefully. He read the technical specifications that his analysts had assembled from the sensor readings. He looked at the mass figures, the energy signatures, the fold transit arrival method that his people had never seen before. He looked at the withdrawal confirmation from all 3 human systems. He looked at the timeline. From the transmission by Admiral Weiss to the completion of the Zethali withdrawal was 3 hours and 41 minutes. He thought about standing at the observation window with Laura Mitchell. He thought about the probe. Unclassified mass concentrations 7743, A, 7743, B, and 7743C. He thought about how long the humans must have been working on this while he and everyone else in the galaxy looked at them and saw exactly what they had been shown. He picked up a pad and wrote a short message to the human ambassador. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. When Laura returned to the council floor, the chamber was quieter than she had ever experienced it. Not silent. The technical sounds were all there, the ventilation, the soft hum of communication systems, the faint ambient noise of a working station. But the quality of attention in the room had changed. It had the particular density of people who have just been forced to revise a large assumption. She took her seat. She did not give a speech. She did not explain. She placed a formal communication on the council floor, a request that the Galactic Concorde acknowledge the documented Zethali military action against sovereign human colonial territory, and a request for a formal vote on censure. Ellen asked if any delegation wished to speak before the vote. The Zethali delegation's prepared script had not covered this situation. Cord sat very still and said nothing. Nobody else spoke either. The vote was called. It passed 58-0, with one abstention from a delegation whose member species had a constitutional prohibition on voting in disputes involving military force. The Zethali delegation did not vote. Laura noted the result. She thanked the council. She sat back down. She did not allow herself to feel anything yet. She had learned early in her career that the moment after a significant result was the most dangerous moment for a diplomat, because relief and satisfaction were both enemies of clear thinking, and there was still work to be done. But she noted privately that for the first time in 4 years of sitting in this chamber, several ambassadors who had never once made direct eye contact with her were now looking at her with an expression she had not seen directed at a human representative before. She did not let herself think too hard about what that expression meant. She was still the same person she had been yesterday. The world was just different now. Carl Weiss kept the 3 Titans in place for 6 hours after the last Zethali ship cleared the outer boundary of the Juno system. He did this because Nathan had told him to, and because Nathan's reasoning was sound. The withdrawal needed to be complete and verified before the fleet stood down, and complete meant not just the combat vessels, but the support ships, the logistics elements, the communication relay units that the Zethali had positioned throughout all three systems. Every piece of Zethali military presence needed to be gone before the Titans moved. Carl used those 6 hours to do something he had been putting off. He walked the Titan. Not all of it. That would have taken days. But he walked the sections he had not visited in the 3 years he had been stationed aboard. The residential corridors where the crew of 300 lived and slept and ate. The engineering decks where technicians he had never met by name kept systems running that he understood only in the broadest conceptual terms. The observation platforms on the outer hull where you could stand and see the curve of the ship beneath you and the stars above and feel, if you stood there long enough, a peculiar sensation of something that was almost but not quite like standing on a world. He stopped at an observation platform near the midsection of the ship and stood for a while. From here he could see the other 2 Titans at their positions, enormous and dark against the stars, lit only at their edges where their running systems produced faint light. They looked like planets. Not quite like planets. Like the idea of planets, rendered in metal and human stubbornness and 30 years of very quiet work. He thought about what he was holding. He thought about this carefully, standing on the hull of something 4,000 kilometers wide, because he was a careful man, and this was a question that deserved careful thought. The Titan fleet could end the Zethali Empire. Not immediately, not without loss. But the outcome of a sustained engagement would not be in doubt. The Zethali had the largest military in explored space. They had more ships than anyone else, better weapons than anyone else, more territory and more resources than anyone else. And none of that mattered against what Carl was standing on, because scale changed the nature of a conflict entirely, and what he commanded was on a different scale from anything the Zethali had ever fought. He could also end the Morith Alliance if he chose to. He could end the Virati Compact. He could, in principle, end the Galactic Concord itself, not militarily but practically, by making it irrelevant. He had no intention of doing any of these things. That was not the point. The point was that he now carried the capacity for outcomes he had never wanted and would never choose, and he carried them permanently. You could not build something like the Titans and then unlearn the fact that they existed. You could not return to a version of the galaxy where they had not been made. The 3 ships beneath him and around him were a permanent fact now, and everything the galaxy did from this point forward would be done in the knowledge of that fact. He had spent 3 years thinking about the moment of deployment. He had thought about it tactically, logistically, procedurally. He had run scenarios in his head about how the Zethali might respond, how the Concord would react, what the political consequences would be. He had not thought very much about what came after. Standing on the hull in the quiet, with the crisis technically resolved and the withdrawal complete and the colonies safe, Carl thought about what came after for the first time and found that it was a large and complicated question that he did not have simple answers to. He turned and walked back inside. Veth's message arrived on Laura's personal secure channel at 1940 station time. It was short. It said, "I find myself with a question I would like to ask you in person, if you are willing. There is no diplomatic purpose to the meeting. It is a personal question, and I would understand if you preferred not to answer it." Laura read it 3 times. Then she sent a reply, saying she would meet him at the same observation lounge where they had spoken before at 2100 hours. Patrick looked at her when she told him. She said she would be fine on her own. He looked at her for another moment, and then nodded and did not push it, which was one of the things she valued most about him. Veth was already at the window when she arrived. He was standing in the same position as before, looking out at the lights of the station, and for a brief moment the scene felt so similar to their previous meeting that Laura was struck by how different everything else was. He turned when he heard her come in. They stood facing each other for a moment without speaking. The station's sounds filled the quiet between them. His question, he said, was a simple one. He had spent the afternoon looking at the timeline of the Titan program, as best as his intelligence service could reconstruct it. The construction appeared to have begun approximately 30 years ago. The design work had apparently begun some years before that. He wanted to know if she was willing to tell him when she had learned about it. Laura considered this for a moment. She said she had been told 4 years ago when she took this posting. He was quiet for a moment. He said that in the 4 years they had been in this station together, attending the same sessions, walking the same corridors, negotiating across the same tables, she had known what was being built in the dark between stars, and she had given no sign of it whatsoever. She said that was correct. He said he was not accusing her of anything. He had done exactly what she had done, which was his job. He had watched her and tried to understand what she was not telling him, and she had watched him do it and told him nothing. He said he respected this. He said he wanted her to know that. She said she understood. Then he asked his actual question, the one he had put in the message. He asked, how long had humans been waiting for this? Laura looked out the window. The station was quieter now than it had been this morning. The emergency sessions had ended. People had gone back to their quarters or their work or the small social routines that continued even on days when large things happened. She thought about the answer to his question. She thought about George Sutter, who had chosen an empty system in the dark and had a heart attack in a hospital in Oslo before he saw what his choice became. She thought about Carol Adkins in her house in the Pacific Northwest. She thought about Diana Ford sleeping 4 hours a night in a suit on the hull of a planet-sized warship. She thought about Nathan Cole staring at Countdown. She thought about herself, for years ago, sitting in a small office in Geneva being briefed by a man with tired eyes who had told her what humanity had built and what her job actually was and what it would require of her. Long enough, she said. Veth looked at her. Then he nodded, once, in a way that meant he had received the answer and understood it and was not going to push for more. He said good night and walked away. Laura stood at the window alone for a while. The lights of the station moved slowly outside. She watched them for a long time. Nathan Cole received a message from Diana Ford at 22:30 station time, which was late by anyone's standard. It said, the pulse system on the third Titan tested clean during post-deployment diagnostics. All 8 dampeners held. The drive core is in perfect shape. I thought you would want to know that the thing we were most worried about worked exactly as it was supposed to. Nathan read this sitting at his desk in the command room, which was the same desk he had been sitting at for 11 years. In the same room, he had spent more hours in than any other room in his adult life. The asteroid field was outside the observation port, as it always was, slow and dark and full of rocks that nobody cared about. He wrote back, good work. Get some sleep. He sat for a moment after sending it. He thought about whether there was more to say and decided there was not, because Diana already knew everything that more words would try to say, and the people who actually understood things rarely needed them spelled out. He pulled up the operational status report. 3 Titans, fully operational. Crew status, nominal. Deployment mission, complete. Colonial sites, secured. Zethali forces withdrawn. Human defense personnel moving back into position. The program log showed a line he had added himself 3 hours ago. It read, primary deployment objective achieved. He looked at that line for a while. 30 years ago, a structural engineer named George Sutter had sat in a room somewhere and drawn up a plan. Not a plan for a ship. A plan for something that had never been built before by any species in the known galaxy. A weapon so large that the word weapon stopped being adequate and became something else entirely, something for which there was not really a good word in any language Nathan was familiar with. George had drawn the plan and passed it up the chain, and the chain had made decisions and allocated resources and kept secrets, and the secrets had been kept for 3 decades by 900 people who had given large parts of their lives to a program with no name on the outside of the building. And it had worked. Not in a simple way. Not in the way of a plan that goes exactly as drawn. The drive core flaw had nearly ended it. The probe had nearly ended it. Laura Mitchell had spent 4 years sitting in a room with people who were trying to read her face and had given them nothing to read. Carl Weiss had held the line between power and restraint in the 4 hours between the transmission and the withdrawal. Diana and Owen had worked on an open hull with a deadline that could not be moved and had finished with minutes to spare. It had worked because a great many people had done difficult things well. Nathan thought about this. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about feelings, but he sat with this for a moment and let it be what it was. Then he turned off the main display and went to find something to eat. Diana and Owen were sitting on the floor of the observation deck on the third Titan when Nathan's message came in. It was a small observation deck near the engineering section, not one of the formal ones. The formal observation decks had been designed for crew briefings and had proper chairs and lighting systems that adjusted automatically. This one was a square room with a large reinforced window and nothing else in it, because it had been built as an inspection access point and nobody had ever bothered to furnish it. Diana and Owen had been coming here for the past week when their shifts ended. They sat on the floor and looked out the window and sometimes talked and sometimes did not talk. Today they were not talking. Outside, one of the other Titans was visible at a distance, its bulk enormous and dark and very still. Diana read Nathan's message. She showed it to Owen. He read it and handed the pad back. They sat in silence for a while after that. Owen said eventually that he had a younger sister who lived on a colony world. Not one of the three that had been attacked, but not far from them either. He said her name was Claire, and she worked in hydroponic agriculture and had 2 kids and did not follow political news very closely. He said she would probably see a headline about this and read it and then go back to whatever she was doing, because to her it would be an event that happened and was resolved and did not personally touch her life. He said he was glad about that. Diana thought about this. She thought about the people she knew who were not part of the program, friends from her university years, her brother in Oregon who repaired boats, her parents who were both retired, and who she called every few weeks and told very carefully curated versions of her life to. They had known she worked in deep space engineering. They had not known much beyond that. She had not been able to tell them, and she had spent a long time making peace with this. She did not know exactly what she felt right now. She was too tired to feel most things cleanly. But she thought that when she was less tired, and when she had slept for a full night and had a proper meal and had been somewhere that was not this ship for a while, she might feel something she recognized. Something like done. Owen asked if she thought they would get to go home soon. She said she thought so. He said he was going to eat an enormous amount of food when he got back. She said that sounded like a good plan. He stretched out his legs and looked out at the stars for a while. After a moment, he said, "Do you think it will actually be different now? Not the politics and the strategy and all of that. Just actually different. For ordinary people." Diana looked out the window. She thought about the Zethali patrols that had sat in human systems and ignored formal protests. She thought about the trade committees that had voted no on reasonable requests because nobody feared the cost of saying no. She thought about 11 settled colonies full of people who had been living at the edge of someone else's tolerance for a generation. "Yes," she said, "I think it will actually be different." Owen nodded slowly. Then he said nothing else, and she said nothing else, and they sat in the quiet and watched the stars and let that be enough for now. Laura Mitchell landed at Denver Transit Hub on a morning in early autumn, 2 weeks after the Concord session. She had not been back to Earth in 3 years. She had known this intellectually while she was away, in a way that you know facts about your own life while you're busy living them. Standing in the arrivals hall with her travel bag and her slightly adjusted perception of normal gravity, she felt it in a different way. The hall was busy. It was a Tuesday morning, and the connecting gates were full of people moving between regional routes. Families with too much luggage. Business travelers with the particular look of people who have done this specific trip many times and are managing their patience. A group of school students in matching yellow jackets, chaperoned by 2 teachers who had the resigned expressions of people responsible for the coordination of children in a large space. Nobody in the hall knew what had happened over the past 2 weeks in any real detail. They knew what they had read, which was that there had been an incident involving colonial territories and that it had been resolved. The resolution had been described in most public reporting as a diplomatic success. The details of how the resolution had been reached were not in the public reporting because the details had not been released. They would be, eventually. Nathan had said there would be a process, carefully managed, for making the Titan program known. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that the people who had paid for it with their taxes and their patience and their trust in institutions that had held secret from them could understand what had been done and why. That process had not begun yet. So the people in the arrivals hall were simply people in an arrivals hall, going wherever they were going, carrying whatever they were carrying, thinking about whatever they were thinking about. Laura found a seat near the gate for the regional connection she was waiting for and sat down. Across from her, at the next gate, a boy of maybe 9 or 10 was sitting with a school bag between his feet, reading something on a display pad. He had the absorbed posture of a child who is genuinely interested in whatever he is reading, leaning slightly forward, one foot swinging. Laura watched him for a moment. She could see from the angle that the pad was showing a news summary, the kind of simple format that educational platforms used, short paragraphs with large text. She could not read the specific words, but she could see the general layout, and she could see the image at the top of the first item, which appeared to be a photograph of the Concorde station. The boy read it for about 30 seconds. Then he swiped away to something else entirely, a game or a video or whatever came next in the queue of things a 9-year-old found interesting on a Tuesday morning at a transit hub. His face as he swiped was completely indifferent to what he had just been reading. Not dismissive, just done with it. The news was a thing that had happened, and he had noted it and moved on, the way children move through the world when the world had not yet taught them to be worried about everything. Laura sat with this for a moment. She had spent 4 years performing calm in the middle of something enormous. She had sat across tables from people who were trying to find the crack in her face, and she had not given them one. She had stood in corridors with Counselor Veth and spoken about geological formations with an expression of mild interest, while knowing that 3 planet-sized warships were waiting in the dark for the moment that had now arrived. She had cast votes and attended dinners and drafted statements and given speeches and done all of the ordinary business of her work while carrying something that was, in the plainest terms, not ordinary at all. And now she was sitting in a transit hub in Denver, watching a child swipe past the biggest news story in human history because he had something more interesting to look at. She thought about what Veth had asked her. How long have you been waiting for this? She had told him long enough, which was accurate, but not complete. The complete answer was harder to put into a single phrase, because the waiting had not been the same all the way through. At first, it had been disciplined, purposeful, a conscious decision to hold something in place until the right moment. Then it had become ordinary, the background condition of her working life. The secret she carried the way you carry a weight you have carried long enough that you stop noticing it until you set it down. And then, at some point she could not precisely identify, it had become something else, something closer to faith. Not religious faith, not hope as a feeling, but faith in the practical sense of continuing to act on a belief in an outcome without knowing when or exactly how the outcome would arrive. She had done her job every day and kept the secret every day and trusted that the people in the dark between stars were doing what they had said they would do. They had. She picked up her travel bag. The gate for her connection had opened, and the other passengers were beginning to move. The school group with the yellow jackets was apparently on the same flight, and the teachers were performing the controlled chaos of counting heads and issuing instructions that the students were accepting with varying degrees of cooperation. Laura stood in the boarding line behind a man in a gray jacket who was reading something on his own pad. She could see the headline from where she was standing. It said something about the Concorde vote and used the phrase significant diplomatic development, which was, she thought, a fairly heroic understatement. The man in the gray jacket finished the article and put his pad away and looked at his boarding card. He did not appear to be changed by what he had read. He looked like a man waiting in a line, thinking about ordinary things. The line moved forward. Laura looked out the tall windows of the terminal. The sky above Denver was the color it only ever was in early autumn, a blue so clear and specific that it did not feel like the same substance as the sky she had grown up calling sky. It was something better than that, something that had no word for it exactly, but that she recognized from childhood as the color that meant the year was turning and the air was clean and something was coming that would be different from what came before. She looked at it for as long as the line allowed. Then she stepped forward through the gate and went home.